will interrupt, whatever. Okay, so we took notes on the reference angles in the last lesson. So this is still on the screen. How we find the reference angles is here on the graph. I've included a little chart here so I could talk about this a little bit. If you are thinking about SATs, for example, there's a few things that if you memorized, it would make things easier. And when I was in school, they had us memorize this portion of the table. And we actually took tests where we regurgitated all of that. I don't really believe in just rote memorization because after the test, you'll forget all of it. But if you are looking for something that would be useful for something like an SAT, or especially if you're taking ACT, I've seen a few of these, and you saw something like, or if you're going to a knowledge bowl and you saw something like, hey, what's sine of 30 degrees in exact form? If you had memorized that was 1/2, that'll make your life just a little bit faster. And if you ever wondered at Knowledge Bowl how they come up with the 0 and the 1 or whatever so quickly, it's basically they just memorized this table. We're going to keep using our methods to do this, and we'll probably use the unit circle when we take the test. You'll have something to look at because I don't feel like memorizing these is necessary. But that's why it's on here. If you memorize these, you could come up with the other half. So they made us memorize these, and we just flipped them to do these. And so that's something that some people do to try to get those really high-end test scores. All right, so we're going to use that a little bit to look at what we're doing today. So it says use reference angles to find the exact value for each trig function. Okay, before we do this, I want to review something that we learned when we were doing the unit circles, and that's whether my answer comes out positive or negative. So remember, over here in the first quadrant, all of your trig functions are positive. I'll just put a little bubble, okay? So that's all students take classes is what we used. So the take means that tangent is positive, and that would mean that cotangent is also positive. In the third quadrant, I'm sorry, that's wrong. This should be sine. The next one's tangent. All students. So this would be sine and then cosecant. This one would be tangent is positive, and that means cotangent would be positive. And then down here, it's cosine is positive. Okay, so we memorize this with all students take classes, A, S, T, C. And then just remember, if you have sine and cosecant, that their reciprocals in the same thing would go with. All right, so I have cosine of 135 degrees. The first thing we have to do, if it says to use reference angles, is to find the reference angle for 135. So the reference angle, 135 would be over here in the second quadrant. So we would take 180 minus 135, and you end up with 45 degrees. So then I can look up in my table that I have here, we've got cosine. So we're going to replace cosine 135 with cosine of 45. So I'm going to go cosine in the table next to 45 degrees, and I have square root of 2 over 2. And then the only thing I have to do is go, okay, in the second quadrant, is cosine positive? Well, sine's positive, but cosine's not listed. So that means on your final answer, for 45, it'd be square root of 2 over 2, but for 135, we have to slap a negative on it because it's in the second quadrant. And the only reason I really teach the reference angle thing is if you memorize this, you could do these on those assessment tests without having the entire unit circle. I like the unit circle personally because it's really easy to follow, and this is a little bit more awkward. But if you had this part of this chart memorized and you knew how to find reference angles, you could do these under pretty much any circumstance. So it's just another way to do the same thing. All right, if I have a negative angle like I do on number 5, what do I do to make it positive?
Like 60.
Okay, so I'm going to add 360 to it. That'll give me 240 degrees. What quadrant would that be in? So that would be down here in 3. This is 0, this is 90, this is 180, down here's 270, and then you come back to 360 over here. So 240 would be between 180, 270, over here somewhere in the third quadrant. So we're going to take that angle and subtract 180. So 240 minus 180 is 60 degrees. So now I'm going to change sine of negative 120 to sine 60, so we can look that up. So here's 60 degrees. In the sine column, it says it is square root of 3 over 2. But remember, it wasn't actually 60. 60 would be in the first quadrant. This actually started off as negative 120 over here in the third quadrant. So look, tangent and cotangent would be the only things that are positive. Sine is not. So instead of just radical 3 over 2, we slip a little negative on the front of that. And that's the only difference between this answer and the answer that was in the first quadrant. So we change it into something that would be first quadrant so you can look it up really easily. And if you were memorizing, so you'd only have to memorize this, which is it's 15 facts instead of 60 or 120 facts. If you start getting negatives and stuff in there, that'd be a lot to memorize. You could, in theory, memorize this and change this to the reference angle and very quickly do these. It's still a lot of memorizing, but not so much as memorizing everything that was on your unit circle. Okay, so we've got tangent 405. So what do I do with the 405 to get the reference angle?
Minus 360.
Minus 360, and we end up with 45 degrees. That is my reference angle. I didn't mark that very well on the first part. And so we're going to switch from tangent 405 to tangent 45. And if we think about 405, it's going around to 360, and then it is just going to stop in the first quadrant where 45 was. And in the first quadrant, everything's positive. So if I look up tangent of 45 degrees, it's 1. I do not have to change that one to negative because it landed in a quadrant where it's going to be positive. Anything that lands up in the first quadrant, your answers will be positive just straight off of the table. This just had to take a little full rotation first. Okay, I only put 1 on here where we're going to switch some things. So I have 7 pi over 6. We've decided we like having these in degrees. So let's switch that first. So I've got 7 pi over 6. I'm going to take it times 180 over pi. The 180s cancel, and you can reduce the 180 and the 6. So think 18 divided by 6 would be 3, add a 0. 6 divided by 6 is 1. And then I can just take 7 times 30 without ever breaking out the calculator. We get 210 degrees. So that's not my reference angle. That's just the same thing as this angle, just in degrees. So then I still have to find the reference angle. So 210 would be over here in the third quadrant again. So we'll subtract 180. So 210 minus 180 is going to give me 30 degrees. So 30 degrees is my reference angle. So I'm going to switch over to secant of 30 degrees. And we do have secant on this table, even though it's not on the part that I said that I would memorize. But secant of 30 is 2 square root of 3 over 3. So I'm going to do 2 square root of 3 over 3. And then I have to think about if secant is positive over here. So tangent and its reciprocal cotangent are positive, but secant and cosine would not be. So I would add a negative.